Okay, right. Chernobyl. How many pages of notes do I have on this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 14. And that's being brief and summarized. So let's get into this. That sounds like a lot, but you have to remember I wrote them by hand because I can't remember anything unless I don't write it by hand, and I prefer writing by hand. So I do that with research I like to do. Right. Thank you. I love you too. Woo! Chernobyl. I'm not on the thing. I need to be on the thing. Come on. There you go, Lavender. There you go. Smart Lavender. So, Chernobyl versus Chernobyl. Most of you probably know this, especially yeah, asked me in Red being from Poland, but Chernobyl is the Russian spelling and pronunciation, and there's been a rightful push, of course, lately to use the Ukrainian name Chernobyl. I use Chernobyl here only to differentiate between the plant and the accident and the land that suffered the consequences. So there's Chernobyl the event, and there's Chornobyl the land. Chornobyl is the older town that existed in the area way, way, way before, even before Russia was involved in the area. The Chornobyl town existed. It takes its name from the Ukrainian word for the locally abundant plant wormwood in English. In Polish, it's written with an A. You say, "Oh, this town loves to swap vowels." Wormwood, of course, is a very bitter herb, and it's the name of a biblical star that falls to Earth. I think it's like it's not a good star falling to Earth. I'll just say that. So the nearby town, this town Chornobyl that was named after the plant, it had a historically large Jewish population. It was a majority Jewish. Unfortunately, they were all but wiped out during World War II with the Nazi Crusade. And they were very poorly commemorated in the aftermath because the USSR wanted to portray the war as fascism versus socialism and not anything else. The local synagogue was turned into an administration building. I think that might be it. I'm not certain, but that might be the building on the bottom photo. But obviously, many of the cemeteries in Chernobyl have many of the cemeteries in Chernobyl have become very famous because people find, a cemetery in the exclusion zone creepy. But a lot of these cemeteries are Jewish cemeteries, so it's very important to be aware of that and not, be aware of like the tragedy beyond the tragedy in this place. After World War II, it was primarily Christian, but officially it was atheist because of the Soviet Union. But, oh no, sorry. Ever since the nuclear disaster, Chernobyl has been one of the primary authorities in the area. So it's where people gather for the scientists, the military, and anyone like that. They usually would gather there. In 2020, 150 people lived there. No news on how the war has impacted them that I could easily find, unfortunately. But when most people hear Chernobyl, the town they think of is Pripyat. Pripyat is an atomgrad, which means it was a new city built to provide for the 30 to 50,000 people, mostly workers and families of the plant, who would need to reside there. There's some old pictures of it here down the bottom. You can see it was very colourful, very lively. The site was chosen due to an abundance of water for the plant's needs. The railway links and unimpressively fertile land was something I saw a lot. They didn't consider it very good land for like the collective farms, so they figured they could put a plant on it. The chief architect of Pripyat was the Chinese-born Maria Protsenko. Um, she was known for bringing an aesthetic flair to the Soviet standardized city planning. And this one, oh, here she is with the map of Chernobyl, Pripyat behind her. You can see it was going to be very big. It was going to be a sprawling city. There'll be more on Maria later. She's kind of emerged as a bit of a hero for me as I was doing this research into Pripyat. But for this city, she followed a modern triangular architectural principles, which emphasized open space, clear zoning, and wide streets. Like you can see here, and you'll see more on the next slide. There's a lot of open space around in the landscape of Pripyat. It looks almost unfinished with how much open space there is. So, big city, but lots of room to grow, lots of nature around. It had 5 schools and 15 kindergartens, which is why a lot of the photos coming out of Chernobyl will are there. A lot of the photos coming out of the zone you will see will be, the babies in gas masks or children's toys posed creepily, and that's because there were 15 kindergartens. That's a lot of kindergartens. And it had a clear centre with the Palace of Culture. So symbolically, leisure and culture and art, that was the heart of the city. And at the time of the disaster, Maria was working on plans to expand Pripyat, which you can see behind her how big it was going to be. And they had the new amusement park, which will become important later. Now, Pripyat was an atomgrad, which was literally an atomic city in Russian. These were usually closed towns, which means people needed permission to enter or to leave. You couldn't just, if you lived in these towns, you couldn't just pop out to the countryside for a picnic. You couldn't visit your family if they lived in these towns. You were very controlled in your movements. You can see here these are more pictures of Pripyat before the disaster. You can see the triangular shapes in the buildings. You can see Cafe Pripyat there and the waterways. You can see how busy this city was. Like it was alive. There was lots of things going on. And you can see in the picture in the top right more examples of the open space. Like that was the center of the city and it doesn't look crowded at all. These closed cities were known as postbox towns after the convoluted method of mailing anything to them, because the mail to them had to be addressed, I think, to other cities or sent through specific post boxes. It was very difficult to contact people who lived in these towns. Some atomgrads were working with plutonium or other materials for producing nukes. Some were running plants like Pripyat, but a lot of them would have been factories that were just working with the byproducts of these plants. So they would have been closed not just to protect, sensitive areas, but secrets of what the Soviets were doing with bombs. But Pripyat, the ninth Vatangrad, was never closed. Pripyat was very different. Its sole focus was energy production, not nukes. So every other Atomgrad was in some way contributing to the production of nuclear weapons. Pripyat's whole purpose was just to power Ukraine, basically. Its citizens enjoyed greater freedom and standards of living than the average Soviet citizens. They were well educated, but mingled easily with the rural locals. They often had more luxuries than the average Soviet citizen. And this was likely because, as the most Western Atomgrad, Pripyat could function as propaganda. So it could be a show for the outsiders, presenting this as like the norm of Soviet citizens, like, oh, look at the futuristic luxury we all live in. And that was not the case for the majority. However, this also functioned as the actual genuine Soviet utopian vision for the future, a thriving city of workers with every need met, living in harmony with nuclear power. So it's simultaneously a lie, and this was what they wanted the future to look like, more Pripyats everywhere. Now, speaking of living in harmony with nuclear power, let's talk about the plant. You can see there that is the Chornobyl plant, I think, before the disaster. But looking at it now, I'm wondering if I can actually see the sarcophagus. But either way, that's the general layout of the plant. The CMPP, which is what it's usually shortened to, was 16.5 kilometers from Chernobyl and 100 kilometers from Kiev. It had RBMK reactors, which most people know now because of the HBO Chernobyl show has made that a bit of a heavy word. Its sister plant is actually still active in Kursk. It was supposed to shut down in 2023, but it's still going until 2030 at the minute. And Kursk not only has a similar plant, but they also built an Atomgrad that looks quite similar to Pripyat for the plant. In previous documentaries and shows, Kursk and its town have the Kursk power plant and town have been stand-ins for the original Pripyat. By 1983, the plant had 4 reactors and it was producing 10% of Ukraine's power. A 5th reactor was 70% complete and a 6th was 20% complete. Cooling towers were mid-construction at the time of the disaster because the cooling pond couldn't support how many reactors they were planning to build. They planned 6 more reactors for the other side of the river. Had this been completed, the CMPP would have been there. The CMPP would have become the largest power plant in the world. The steam turbines won the State Prize of Ukraine for their design in 1982. So, on the face of it, Pripyat and the CMPP are both futuristic and safe. They were supposedly the very best of what the Soviet Union had to offer for nuclear power. And yeah, on the face of it, you look at all of this and you go, wow, that is cutting edge. But in 1982, Reactor 1 suffered a partial core meltdown due to a faulty cooling valve. Now, nobody was hurt, but the radiation was vented out with steam for several hours. That's not great. Don't vent radiation out of your nuclear plant. And in 2021, declassified KGB documents revealed the CMPP's structure, like the structure of the building, was known to be unstable as early as 1983. The steam separator room could reach temperatures of 270 degrees Celsius. That's Celsius, not Fahrenheit. 270 degrees. Now, an oven can reach a maximum of like 200, 220. Now, this enormous amount of heat was causing the building to weaken and stretch, and it was possible, very possible actually, that even if the disaster hadn't occurred, the steam separator room would have collapsed, and that would have dropped the steam separators onto the reactor, which would have cracked the reactor and probably caused the meltdown anyway. So, yeah, not as safe as it seems on the surface, actually. That 2021 revelation is very new. There might be more to come out, because that's a pretty damning problem with the building itself. And it also explains why, since the disaster, the building has been more unstable than people expected. Now, the risk. Disclaimer: I am not a nuclear scientist. I am a humanities graduate trying to simplify very complex concepts into something both you and I will understand. So, if you're watching this and you know anything about nuclear power or about. Oh boy. I just realized I didn't start the recording. Oh, fuck me. Okay. I'll start the recording now. I'm gonna have to download the board. Oh, I hate myself. Nope, you go back. You go back. There you go. Okay. Anyway. So, disclaimer. I am not a nuclear scientist. I'm a humanities graduate trying to explain very simple concepts. No, I'm a humanities graduate trying to explain very complex notions. I'm trying to explain complex shit here. And I don't understand the minutiae of the science. So if you're watching this and you do understand the minutiae and the maths of the science, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, the geography of the area, a common theory is that the geography of the area is highly susceptible to radiation contamination. Because it's wet, it's marshy, and it's full of permeable soil. Which is very easy for. I didn't write it down, but 2 key radioactive isotopes to contaminate the area. So, a common theory is that Chernobyl was contaminated long before the disaster due to both waste storage and the globally high rate of nuclear testing at the time. Like, the nuclear testing wouldn't have made a massive amount of difference to the area, but on the whole, this area would have been mildly more radioactive than other areas of the world even before this disaster happened. That's a commonly held theory. It's not one I massively understand, but I do find it interesting that the very things that made the location good for a nuclear plant made that plant more of a danger to the area. Now, Reactor 4 required 45 million litres of water an hour to cool it, even in a shutdown state, because even in a shutdown state, there would be residual heat and energy from the reaction. It takes a while to stop. It's a very big reaction. And so if there was a total blackout, Chernobyl's emergency diesel generators would take 60 seconds to fully power on and run the coolant pumps. This was an unacceptable risk. That was 60 seconds where the reactor was not being cooled. Now, the plant team had a theory that the steam turbines, as they wound down during a blackout, could produce enough energy to pump coolant for 45 seconds. And now that sounds pretty sensible because the reactor has residual heat, the turbines have residual kinetic energy, and it would bridge the gap while the generators got up to speed. So this would make the plant safer. So they came up with a way to test this theory. Here for pictures, you can see how much water they had and how close it is to the plant. It was very important that the reactor always be cooled with water. And you can see the size of the top of the reactor room there. I think that's reactor 3. It's normally reactor 3 that they take tour groups into, but it might be 1 or 2, but I think those are being disassembled. Now, step 1. Step 1, reduce the thermal power of reactor 4 to 700 to 1000 megawatts. Run the steam generators at full speed. 4 pumps would be run by the steam 4 pumps would be run by the steam turbines as they wound down. 4 would be run by outside power. So there would still be 4 pumps performing at the rate they should have, regardless of what the steam turbine pumps did. Step 3, it would turn off the steam supply, shut down the reactor. Those are basically the same things. They would measure the voltage provided by the coasting turbines, and after the emergency generators came online and could completely take over pumping the coolant, they'd allow the turbines to wind down. Basically, this was a test to see if we had a total blackout and nothing to rely on but the residual energy of the turbines, could they cool the reactor for us while we got the diesel generators online? This test had been attempted and foiled 3 times in 4 years. One time I think the instruments didn't collect the information they needed. 2 more times it just failed. It didn't work. Now, the test in practice. Yes, there's a photo from HBO Chernobyl here, because if you can believe it, they did not stop to take photos the night of this test. Now, even before the test began, there were problems. An outage at another power plant delayed the test over 12 hours. So night shift had not prepared to run the test, day shift had, but now night shift had to run the test. There was a sudden power drop to 500 megawatts, then to 30 megawatts when AR2's ionization chamber malfunctioned. They're not sure why the ionization chamber malfunctioned. Even now, they give differing accounts of why that was. Sorry about the scraping noise, checking my notes. Now, the implications of the safety benefits, as well as the presence of Dyatlov, who co-authored the actual test plan, probably gave the team the motivation and confidence, respectively, to continue despite the issues. If this test proved correct, it would be very important for the safety of the plant, and it would have big implications for the safety of other nuclear plants. And Dyatlov wrote the test, so he, as far as they knew exactly what he was doing, and it would have been a great thing if it worked. So they pushed on. Then, when the test began in earnest, the power was at just 200 megawatts, which, if you remember, it's supposed to be above 700 megawatts still for this test. So that's like 500 megawatts less than it should have been. But they continued. When the power dropped again when more coolant was introduced to counteract this, more control rods were removed from the reactor. They had been removing control rods continuously because of the unexpected power drops. And control rods are what neutralize the reaction. So basically, they were removing the rods that would stop the reaction from getting bigger. So the reactor now, unfortunately, because they removed these last few rods, now had less than the 15 necessary control rods inserted, and the coolant was now too hot and full of steam voids. So the coolant, ironically, was unable to cool before it was cycled back through. It was boiling and filling the chamber with steam. This creates a positive feedback loop. Steam voids are just what they sound like. They're pockets of gas in the boiling coolant, and they're a problem because the gas is not able to absorb neutrons as quickly as water. So it's not as cooling and stabilizing as water. So if you're putting in a certain amount of coolant, you're expecting it to cool the reactor a certain amount. It's not going to do that if it's full of steam voids, because they're not going to cool the reactor as efficiently as water will. So this means the coolant is less effective, and the reactor produces more power because its reaction is not being suppressed. More power means more heat, means water gets hotter, means more steam voids, which means more reaction, which means water gets hotter, which means more steam voids, which means more reaction, which means you see how it gets away from you. Now, the control rods had successfully prevented this feedback loop from activating, but now less than 15 were inserted, and the reactor was primed to run away with itself. Something I haven't written here, but I remember, there was no warning on the console to tell them how many control rods were inserted. Even though you needed at least 15 inserted at any one time for safety reasons, there was no notice on the console to tell them, hey, you've got less than 15 inserted. They had to keep track of that themselves. So they probably didn't realize that they had fucked themselves because nothing was telling them that they had done anything wrong. Now, at 23 minutes and 4 seconds past 1 a.m. in the morning, the test officially begins. At 23 minutes and 40 seconds past 1 a.m. in the morning, an emergency shutdown is initiated by somebody. So just 36 seconds later, it all goes to hell. So in the span of it's one of the most chilling parts of this disaster is that in just 36 seconds it goes from everything's fine to there's a nuclear meltdown and it's too late. There's nothing they can do. Now, we'll likely never know who or why initiated the shutdown because the only two people who could have made that decision, Akimov or Toptunov, died as a result of the meltdown. Allegedly, the plan was to power the reactor down for maintenance, but the RBMK designers dispute the record, and they say a meltdown would have already been in progress when the order was given. Or the switch was hit, even. Now, this is... Before, this used to be one of the most niche parts of the disaster, I'd say, but since HBO Chernobyl, I feel like this is the part everyone really understands, which is important. It's great that people understand this now. So all the control rods were reinserted because of the emergency shutdown. This should have neutralized the reaction and safely shut down the reactor. However, as they had already learned in Lithuania at this point, the neutralizing water would be briefly displaced by the more reactive graphite tips. Despite this risk being known, it was believed the conditions under which this would spike power as it did in Chernobyl would never occur, which is, well, not funny, but darkly humorous perhaps, because the conditions were present from pretty much the moment records of the tests begin. Like, there is a tiny window of opportunity in this test where this reaction wouldn't have happened, and it had gone a long time ago. Now, the intensifying reaction overheated the core, the fuel cladding failed, the fuel elements were released into the coolant, and then... oh god. And then there were two explosions. A steam explosion blasted the upper plate of the reactor through the roof of the building. The coolant lines ruptured, and the fuel rods fractured. What coolant remained turned to steam, carrying radioactive isotopes out with it through the new hole in the roof of the building. The last measurement of the reactor output reads 30,000 megawatts. However, this was the highest the console could possibly read. We do not know the actual final reading. So, God knows how much this thing was producing. It's terrifying to think about. the console froze, I think, forever on that reading, in Reactor 4 because they've cleaned up the Reactor 4 control room and you can now tour it. And there's a lot of pictures, and that console reading is still stuck on 30,000 megawatts. And remember, the reactor was usually producing about 1,000 megawatts. So it's 30 times higher, and that's not even the amount it probably actually was. That's a lot of energy and power. And that's probably why the reactor explodes a second time, ejecting 25% of its contents to the roof, and the remaining contents catch fire. Now, the cause of the second explosion is very hotly debated. The first explosion is very simple. There was a lot of steam, it was very hot, it put a lot of pressure in a airtight container, and it exploded. The second explosion, they're not so sure, but the most recent suggestion is that the reactor was behaving similarly to a fizzled nuclear bomb. Now, a fizzled nuclear bomb is essentially, from what I could gather, a nuclear bomb that doesn't have the expected payload. So it still produces an explosion, but it's not. It's underpowered basically. So this reactor was acting like an underpowered nuclear bomb, which is terrifying and horrible to think about. Now, containment. Firefighters were on the scene by 1:45. Sorry, I was deciding how to say that. I was deciding between 45 minutes past 1 and 1:45. But there's differing accounts of their knowledge. Some claim they had no idea of the danger and they were free-handing graphite chunks from the reactor. Some claimed they knew the danger completely, but they had a moral duty to extinguish the roof fires to prevent reactor 3 from going up as well. Regardless of how much they knew, many of them died of acute radiation sickness within weeks. They reported a metal taste and pins and needles in their face. Roof fire was extinguished by 5 a.m., but the reactor fire continued until May 10th. So remember, the whole reason I'm doing this PowerPoint today is April 26th is the anniversary. So that's about 2 weeks the reactor fire continues for. Now, radioactive waste had been thrown out, and every moment that fire continued, more of it was being funneled out through the smoke. Now, helicopter pilots dropped about 5,000 tons of sand, boron, lead, and clay to put out the fire, but almost none of these reached the reactor we now know. At the time, it was thought that these had helped put out the fire, but now we think that the fire burned itself out, and most of these ended up in the basement with the elephant's foot. These pilots were risking huge exposure. They were flying straight over the reactor to dump this in. A lot of people think about the liquidators on the roof, but they don't think about the dose that these helicopter pilots received. Now, subway builders and coal miners were brought in to drill under the plant to install cooling pipes and a concrete graphite sandwich plate to prevent material escaping the basement, because that was the big fear, that the basement was going to be burned through and all of this radioactive material was just going to seep into the land. Now, this was eventually not needed, but its design resembles later modern foundations for nuclear plants. They use a core catcher design, which is basically this same concept, but it's built into the plan at the time that it's first constructed. So this shows how much was being learned here and how quickly about how much we need to do to contain nuclear disasters. Now, dosimeters could not read the off-the-scale Rontgens. Now, people had no accurate way of knowing how much danger they were in. Even educated plant workers, so Akimov, who would have had the responsibility for calling the emergency shutdown, he was fooled by the inaccurate readings, and he believed the reactor was somehow still intact despite the explosions, because the dosimeters were not showing, the huge numbers you'd expect. But that was because they literally couldn't show those numbers because they weren't expecting to have to show those numbers. So nobody there had any way of knowing how much danger they were in accurately. They knew there was a danger, but they weren't able to measure it. Now, something a lot of people know, robots were unable to operate on the roof. They would literally shut down and fail because of how much radiation was up there. So the debris had to be cleared by hand by people who could only spend less than 90 seconds on the roof doing so. So there's 600,000-ish people recognized as Chernobyl liquidators, and this includes not just the roof cleaners or the people like our friend here who is spraying down the vehicles and the roads. It was anyone who was involved in the cleanup. This was a very complex operation. There were a lot of people doing a lot of different jobs. So the grand total is very big, and it keeps growing, actually. And the full effect on them is still being measured. They're honored with a quite famous statue in the exclusion zone. I don't have a picture of it here because I'm an idiot, but there is a lovely statue in the zone. I think it's near the plant or near Pripyat, dedicated to them. Containment Part 2. Let me see. Right, okay. Now, the USSR tried to contain not just radiation, but news and information. Pripyat was not evacuated for a full day, and when they were evacuated, they were told it would just be for 3 or 5 days they would be leaving. Maria Protsenko, our old friend who is pictured down here in a refugee camp because, oh boy, the horrors Russia inflicted on this woman did not end. And she had to flee Ukraine because of their invasion. I think she is safely in Germany now. But I bring her up because she was coordinating the evacuation of all the vehicles leaving the city because she had the maps and she knew the city best. So she was one of the last people to leave the city, and she was directing vehicles, sometimes by hand, out on the streets, telling them where to go. So she's an unsung hero, and I wanted to highlight her because the role of women in the Chernobyl disaster is, undervalued. Because it's such a scientific disaster, a lot of people assume it's something for men and women weren't involved. And Maria Protsenko's work is in not just building the town but then evacuating it is something I wanted to highlight because of that. And also, that she's still suffering now. Although she is, like I say, fortunately safe now. This woman is just a hero. I love her. I love this woman. Now, locals gathered to like gawk at the lights of the fire at the plant because there was a sort of. It's often said there was a sort of blue light because of the ionizing radiation, and some, like a local police patrol, mistook radioactive material falling on them for harmless ash or at first even snow. The surrounding villages were so badly irradiated they had to be completely bulldozed. And despite this, again, there was no evacuation for at least a day. And some of these surrounding villages weren't even evacuated then, they were evacuated later. But they were so badly irradiated they bulldozed them. The 1st of May Workers' Day celebrations in Kiev were ordered to go ahead because the background radiation there was being observed as normal. So despite, the horrors happening not that far away, they were told, no, you have to go ahead and celebrate. The USSR only admitted to the disaster when confronted with evidence by Sweden, who went, hey bro, why am I measuring massive radiation around my plant? And why did we trace it back to you? And the USSR said, no, that's not us. That's some other guy with a nuclear plant. And Sweden said, okay, well, I'm going to call the Nuclear Commission and tell them because I'm a bit worried here. And then the USSR went, oh, you know what? That was me. My bad. So, with all this horrible radiation coming out of the plant, they needed to contain it somehow. Thus, the sarcophagus, which is the shelter built over the reactor that you can see in the little picture here. Although it's quite a big picture, actually, thinking about it. Now, it included a radiation shielding wall to protect the workers of Reactor 3, which remained operational. So, yeah, while they were building this containment, just next door, Reactor 3 and 1 and 2 were still operating. Yeah. So they needed to contain 200 tons of corium, 30 tons of dust, and 16 tons of uranium/plutonium mix. If you're wondering what corium is, it's a word that was created, I think, because of Chernobyl. Because they needed a word for the mix of fuel contents and concrete and sand that was created. Thus, corium, because it was made up of the fuel core. The fuel core, oh my god. Because it was made up of the fuel elements that made up the reactor, the core. Okay. Now, the crane operators worked blind from lead boxes to put up the walls. They were directed by spotters who were standing at a safe distance. So, you're in a lead box working blind, moving heavy metal objects with a crane while someone tells you over a radio what to do. That's horrifying. There were many holes for ventilation, and it was reliant on the unstable, crumbling structure of Reactor 4, which, if you remember, was unstable even before a giant hole was blasted into it. But the reason for this is it was only intended to last 30 years. It was an immediate, panicked band-aid, we have to cover this right now because it's poisoning us thing. By 1996, birds were able to fly in and out of the structure through ventilation holes. There's footage captured by the BBC of a bird just casually flying in and out of the Chernobyl sarcophagus. By 2006, water was leaking in through the roof, and it was seeping radioactive elements into the soil, which was, the whole reason they did the basement drilling, to prevent that. Oh, wait, nope, hang on. You didn't see that. Shh. I'm a good streamer who knows when I want to change the PowerPoint slide. You didn't see that. Now, but far worse than the crumbling reactor structure, far worse than the birds nesting in the sarcophagus, is the lid. Now, to me, the lid is the scariest part of the entire ruins that nobody ever talks about. God, I don't want to be doing I'm not trying to do exploitative. This is the scariest part of the Chernobyl disaster here. The lid genuinely scares me, and people don't talk about it a lot, and I want people to talk about it, so I'm going to teach you about why the lid terrifies me. The lid is a thick concrete slab teetering 15 degrees from fully vertical over the reactor. it is balancing on debris and a weakened roof over volatile nuclear waste. Actually, no, it's not balancing on the weakened roof. It is just balancing on the debris that is in the reactor from the roof, is what I meant to write here. If it fell, it would throw up a huge cloud of radioactive dust. Radioactive dust is one of the most lethal dangers in the exclusion zone because it allows alpha radiation to enter our bodies. Generally, alpha radiation can't penetrate the skin, so it's considered less of a worry. However, if you inhaled radioactive dust or it was able to enter your body for another way, it is considerably more lethal to you than the other form. Well, maybe not considerably, but it is considered to be more lethal to you than the other forms of radiation because it gets straight in there. It doesn't have to pass through the skin because it's already in there. You know what I'm saying? Once it's in there, it's in there. It's going to sound bad out of context. Okay. Now, even if it did not also break the fragile shelter with the impact of it crashing down on the reactor, a large amount of dust would still escape. So, even in the best case scenario, radioactive dust still escapes. This is a model of what the inside of the reactor room looks like. You can see, if you look at this little cylinder here in the middle, you can see how the lid of that cylinder is now basically fully vertical and teetering within it, and the fuel rods or the control rods, which are they? That are now jammed in there are the only things keeping it in that position. So it's a very unstable configuration. Before we had when it was just the sarcophagus, this lid was a huge worry. When it was going to tip and what would happen were very scary things to consider. Thus, the Chernobyl new safe confinement. These are some pictures for you. I want to talk about the pictures first, just so you can see how big it is. If you look really closely at the picture on the top right, you can see the double door entrance in the middle at the end of the road. Now consider how big 2 double door garages would normally be in comparison to you, and then consider how tiny they are on this structure. And then look at how it towers over the pine forests in Pripyat. And then look at the bottom left, where you can see the old sarcophagus inside the new safe confinement. And you can see that large structure looks tiny in there, because that's how big this is. The new safe confinement is the largest moving structure ever built. It cost 1.5 billion euros to make, and it was an international effort, so bits of it were built everywhere. The installation was done by workers from various countries. It is truly everyone getting together to contain this monstrosity. Hi Mina, welcome back. Yay, yeah, you didn't miss the Chernobyl part. You've actually come back just as I'm getting into the stuff I'm most excited to talk about, and less depressed to talk about. Now it's airtight, so you have to go through an airlock to enter this thing, and it's decay resistant. It's built with stainless steel, I want to say, something that won't decay in the rain. Now inside, the old sarcophagus is being dismantled. I don't know if the war has impacted the timeline, but at this time, supposedly, the old sarcophagus should be mid-dismantlement. So that old, rotting thing should be taken apart by now. and the new safe confinement has covered the reactor since 2016. So, yeah, exactly 30 years since the sarcophagus went on, they covered it with something else. So that was a very good estimation by the sarcophagus builders. And now we get into the aftermath. So first of all, the aftermath on the land. You can see here Pripyat being swallowed up by the pine forest, and Przewalski's wild horse chilling in the zone. 1 second, taking a drink. Blah. Okay. Now, after the disaster, there was an exclusion zone there was an exclusion zone 30 kilometers in every direction from the plant. That was then expanded later to a 2,600-kilometer zone of alienation. So, yeah, a much bigger area than anticipated was affected. It's become an involuntary nature park, a radiological reserve. Yeah, obviously sorry guys. Chernobyl is so close to Belarus that the exclusion zone extends partly into Belarus as well. I'm terribly sorry if it's actually Belarus or Belarus. Now that I'm thinking about it, I may be saying it wrong. Oops. Belarus has the Polesi State Radio Ecological Reserve, which is their side of the exclusion zone, basically. Polesi receives much less attention than the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but it receives greater scientific focus than tourism. No, I don't know why I put that but there. What I'm trying to say is, Belarus has generally treated this as a area of science, and they don't have the expanding tourism industry that Ukraine has for the zone. Without humans, flora and fauna have flourished. Even Pripyat is overgrown with large pine trees, and many animal species uniquely thrive here. They've got wolves, dogs, cats, storks, beavers, and deer. And catfish actually live in the abandoned cooling pond. And over 100 of the endangered Przewalski's wild horse live in the zone after an initial 31 were released. So the zone has been the site of at least one very successful animal preservation project, which is great. So some studies suggest there have been animal mutations, but they've almost all been discredited. It's a subject of debate at the moment. It's something we probably won't have measured for a few more generations. But it seems to have little impact on general animal health. And in fact, the lack of humans in the area has been great for animal health. It's become something of a thriving nature paradise. Aside from the nuclear poison soil. The biggest immediate threat from zone animals to us, aside from, wolves being feral wolves, is the radioactive dust in their fur. Because, like I said, dust is one of the biggest threats of the zone, because it takes less alpha radiation to have lethal impact if it can get into you, which it can only do through something like inhaling dust. So, there's a great video I've watched 100 times of a guy who's darting one of the Chernobyl wolves to, take its vitals, study it as part of a project, and he is stroking the wolf with gloves and his mouth covered with a mask, and he says, the only thing I fear about this animal isn't a mutation or that it's going to kill me. The thing I fear about this animal is that when I move its fur, I'm letting out radioactive dust. One area of pine trees changed colour as it died under the initial fallout path, and it became known as the Red Forest. Now, the trees of the Red Forest were bulldozed and buried by liquidators, to contain the radiation, but now people fear that the trees will bleed radiation into the soil as they decay. One cool thing the zone has revealed is radiotrophic fungi. They take food, aka energy, from ionizing radiation. And this has in turn led to limited testing of using the fungi to protect humans from radiation in cancer treatments or space travel. This research remains largely hypothetical, but it is a very exciting potential that this thing discovered because of a horrible human-made disaster could actually end up helping us. However, there are reasons that humans stay away. This isn't a wonderful, free land to roam in. The topsoil is extremely irradiated, and the groundwater is constantly monitored through wells. They have seen limited radiation impact on the groundwater, but it has to be, like I said, monitored constantly because there's always a threat. And once it is irradiated, it will be very hard to clean it up. A lot of the reason for the topsoil irradiation is there's a lot of waste like vehicles or the red forest that have been buried underground to contain the radiation so it doesn't impact humans. But in turn, this makes it hard to predict where radiation will spike without a dosimeter or knowledge of the land. Um, there's a guy called Shai who's been to the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone a lot of times as a stalker. There's at least one video where they're just walking along and they suddenly have to stop because the dosimeter starts screaming because they wandered over too close to something that is buried and they have to go back and double back, basically. Uh, However, vodka is safely produced in the zone and sold commercially, and honey is farmed in Polesi. Now, however, there is a problem for nature. There is another problem for nature. Dry forest waste can't break down as easily due to radiation killing off the small organisms that would normally be breaking it down. So this creates a huge wildfire risk. In 2015 and 2020, the there were big wildfires. The forest and a well-known, very popular, abandoned forest camp were all burnt down, and a great deal of radiation was released by the fire. So it's one of those things you wouldn't think about. There's so much danger there from radiation. You don't think about forest fires, but that's one of the consequences of radiation. There are more you are more likely to have a forest fire. And as global warming gets worse, that risk is going to get higher and higher. There's a reason that 2020 is when they had the worst fire there, and it's because that was a very bad hot year for Europe. Now, the people in the aftermath. There's a common misconception that Chernobyl caused birth defects, but there's no actual evidence of a rise in birth defects. Across countless studies out there, there's only clear evidence that there was an increase in cancer. So there's a lot of horror stories, and I'm sure there have been cases of people of babies born that were affected by Chernobyl. There is at least one well-known case. But on the whole, in terms of in on the whole, in terms of the studies conducted, there isn't a rise in a trend in birth defects. There is, however, after Chernobyl, a rise in abortions across Europe from people terrified that they were possibly going to have a birth defect or a mutation in their baby from Chernobyl's radiation. Now, a large variety of people cross the zone boundary every single day like it's just a railway crossing. Security staff, scientists, tourists. There's locals that live on the edge of the zone. They cross in and out daily for various reasons. And also, one of the big reasons people go into the zone is still the plant. So Unit 3 continued producing power until the year 2000. And so did Units 1 and 2. Unit 3 was just the latest to shut down in 2000. On top of containing and monitoring Reactor 4, the nuclear staff are needed to decommission these reactors because they can't just be left there, even though they're not being used. They have to be safely decommissioned the same as any normal nuclear power plant would. Nuclear staff commute to the plant each day from Slabotich via direct train. They arrive on the train, they pass through radiation scanners at the station, they change in lockers at the station, and then they board a direct bus to the plant. So that now the reason they mainly come from Slabotich is because it was the town built to house the refugees from Pripyat after the disaster. It was built 45 kilometers away. It was the last city built by the USSR, and most people living there are still staff, ex-staff, or children of staff of the CMPP projects. There's a lot of memorials to the disaster there. A lot of people there. As I was saying, Darman Richter, who I will talk more about later, in his book Chernobyl: A Stalker's Guide, he spoke to people now living in Slabotich, and they all said, this town is wonderful, but Pripyat was special, and we feel the loss of Pripyat still. Slabotich has actually cooperated with the UN lately for a project about maintaining your town in times of mass immigration or pressures driving people away from your town, because a lot of people have left it because of the war, because it and the zone are right on the border, and it was occupied for quite some time. When it became clear, wait, what is that? Oh, that's Slabotich. Sorry, yeah, that's Slabotich. You can see it's got a lot of open space like Pripyat had. It's following similar principles of a clear center of town, just like Pripyat. You can see USSR influence on its architecture. When it became clear the evacuation was permanent, several residents of sorry, hang on, I have to lift this up or my model looks like I'm about to faceplant through the camera. When it became clear the evacuation was permanent, several residents of villages within the zone illegally returned to their home. The Samosli are still there today. They trade with all the zone visitors and staff. One man, this is a little anecdote, one man would round up the local cats every night and bring them into his home so they wouldn't get eaten by the local wolves. For further research into the Samosli, see Claire Baker's study on their weaving and textile arts, or The Babushkas of Chernobyl, which is a short documentary about the old women who returned to the zone. It is interesting to me that the general legend about the zone is that, young men go into it searching for adventure, and actually some of the first people to return to the zone were just old women who didn't want to leave their homes. Now, these various zone dwellers have understandings with each other and an ecosystem of their own. Security can be more lenient with locals. They know who often give them alcohol or food for favors. It was once said you could climb the Dugar, but you needed 2 bottles of vodka. One to get the courage to climb up there, and one to bribe the guards when you got down to the ground. There's a they especially the guards and especially the checkpoint guards and the locals, take a sort of collective responsibility for feeding the dogs and the cats of the zone. Although at first, the military, at first, the cleanup operation included killing most of the dogs because they were feared as carriers of radiation, but several of them hid, survived, and now their descendants are happily cared for by the people who still remain in the zone. There's both legal tourists and illegal stalkers who visit the zone every day. Um, so that's just another example of how many people, for so many different reasons, are coming to the zone. It's very important to me that you understand that the exclusion zone is alive with people and personality. This is often seen as, a thing frozen in time with no humans, but that is not the case. It is alive with people with stories and rich inner lives. Yeah, that's I wanted to make sure that was the last one. Yeah. Now, you may have heard me say legal tourists and stalkers, and you may have said, "What the hell is a stalker?" And you can't talk about Chernobyl's people without tourists and stalkers. Stalkers are those who enter the zone illegally, not on permitted tours to explore or scavenge or, God knows what they get up to in there. The name actually has little to do with stalking. It comes from Roadside Picnic. That's a novel we'll come back to later, which was adapted into the Tarkovsky movie Stalker and inspired the Stalker, all capitals, game series. In the books and film and the games, stalkers are just in the book and film, stalkers are those who enter a supernaturally damaged landscape to loot or procure a wish from the entity at its center. The video games Stalker were the ones to popularize in pop culture. This was already known to like the little groups of people going into the zone, a link between the real life zone and the fictional Tarkovsky zone. As the zone has become increasingly commodified, Stalker has increasingly become a counterculture position, opposing the hotels, the souvenir stands, and increasing tourism that's beginning to dominate the zone. Some of them see the zone as a place of freedom that should not have government regulations or a tourist economy. There's all sorts of lavender noises. There are legends of varying accuracy of secret routes and codes that stalkers share. There have been shrines that have popped up in disused churches that I've seen. Stalkers are often portrayed as, lovable rogues, breaking the rules for a real experience. Some stalkers really do hand themselves over to the police for a ride out of the zone and are treated not as a nuisance rather than a threat. Just like, oh, you know. For a documentary on this, I recommend Stalking Chernobyl by Cultures of Resistance. They also did a great documentary on the I want to say it was on the Freedom Flotilla that was heading to Palestine. But stalkers are not the homogenous culture that I've been talking about here. Some stalkers, for example, would take being caught by the police as a sort of a dishonor, like you failed, you're a bad stalker. Some painted One group of stalkers painted a popular zone landmark pink to discourage tourists and, you know, make people pay less attention to it. But some other stalkers who I put less radical here, but I say they're radical in a different way. They slowly smuggled in paint to return the claw to the yellow and disrepair state that it was in. I'm going to talk more about the claw later. If you're looking at this and going, what the fuck is a claw of death? Don't worry. Don't worry. We'll get to my good friend, the claw of death. And some stalkers are tour guides themselves instead of being, opposed to the tourism industry. They're taking part of it. Or they're at least friends with them. The tour guides, they leave stashes of water and food for the stalkers sometimes for free, sometimes for payment. And furthermore, some stalkers act as guides into the zone and they'll charge a fee themselves. So some of them are more involved in tourism than others would like. And some of them are just locals who go poaching in the zone. Because if you can believe it, there's not much economy around the edges of a ruined nuclear exclusion zone, and people have to eat. That said, there's something undeniably appealing about the image of the illegal rave that happened in the exclusion zone, where all these characters came together to party, and the babushkas commented that they were happy to see the zone alive with young people again. And the stalkers are a part of the ecosystem like any other person in the zone. When the Russians invaded, 2 stalkers were taken captive along with the plant workers at the CMPP. They volunteered to cook for the staff to try and lighten their load as they basically worked non-stop under the Russians. What I'm trying to get at here is the zone is a community. So, why do all these people with so many different reasons all flock to an irradiated wasteland? Reason number 1 is Pripyat. It's commonly said Pripyat is frozen in time, despite the obvious decay that you can see all over it. These are all like little pictures of little fascinating bits of art around Pripyat. Another popular thing is the bus shelters with murals similar to the one you can see. It's the furthest right of the bottom pictures. This is because as former Soviet states remove Soviet imagery, radiation makes it too difficult to do this in Pripyat, especially because Pripyat was a planned city. So the Soviet imagery was able to be planned and weaved throughout its design. What have I written here? So, in the iron fencing, in the decor, in the wall murals you can see here, even in the stained glass window of the Cafe Pripyat that you can see, de-Sovieting Pripyat would be an undertaking. Even without the radiation, it would be a lot of work. The Palace of Culture that was in the center of the city was not unique to Pripyat. This was in most new-build Soviet cities, but the Prometheus cinema was very noteworthy. Now, Prometheus was recognized as Prometheus was reimagined as a Soviet hero, seizing the means of production, aka energy, so the atom in place of fire, for the workers, which was especially relevant to Pripyat. There, an exception was made for the statue of Prometheus that was outside the cinema. This was relocated to the CMPP instead of being left in the city. There are various reasons given for this, but I think it's just because throughout Pripyat, it's one the Prometheus statue is one of the ways that you can see throughout Pripyat an awareness of both the burden and the potential of nuclear power, and it's quite an artistic statement. The way that the atom was weaved into the lives of these people, and it ended up destroying them. Pripyat was modern, organized, and had all a city needed. the atomic imagery and Soviet propaganda were, like I said, weaved into its core, and it was almost, as I said at the very start, a monument to a hopeful Soviet vision for the future. It was utopian and with a complete cultural victory. You were there? Oh, if I could go anywhere in the world, I would love to go to Pripyat. I'm not good at traveling, but if I could go anywhere, it would be to Pripyat. Where was I? Right. Even like the 15 kindergartens, they reflect the way Soviet philosophy shaped the city planning. Because this means lots of childcare was provided because unlike in the US at the time, it was expected both parents would be working. Um yeah. It was a young city, both physically and statistically. It was barely a decade old, and the average age was 26. Pripyat never got to age and gain the problems of older cities. It isn't just frozen in time, it's frozen almost at the moment of creation. The decay isn't from use, but from disuse, and that's probably one of the reasons it's so eerie. Its most abandoned places saw decades of use, and the decay you can see in them is from that use. But Pripyat is very unique because it was barely used before it fell into this state. And one of the reasons it feels so disconcerting to look at sometimes is because you can simultaneously see no decay and massive decay. And it's impossible not to see the wider history reflected in Pripyat, because the fall of the Soviet Union happened not long after this, and here's their grand utopian vision for the future. Literally laying in ruins because of their own actions. It was pretty dangerous because of a lot of wild dogs and stuff, but I saw like 10 feet long catfish. Did you see the cooling pond catfish? Oh, yeah, the wild dogs can be very dangerous as well. Um, did you see any of the Przewalski's wild horses? Let me see. Sorry, I'm just checking what's next. No, the mythology. Well, a tapestry of mythology has been crafted about Chernobyl, and there's a somewhat common belief that there were prophecies about Chernobyl. I'm going to refute this, but let's get into why. I didn't see any horses. But I would see a catfish over a horse. I do think they're pretty cool. Now, for example, a roadside picnic, a story about men entering into a forbidden zone poisoned by alien technology for various reasons, is almost a decade older than the disaster, yet eerily resembles what stalker culture has come to be. That's because stalker culture has modelled itself on this, but, you know, it's still pretty eerie when you read it. Local religious people claimed to have had prophetic dreams and that the biblical star wormwood falling to earth was a warning about the future. A lot of people, no, hang on, I'm not reading from the PowerPoint, I'm reading from my notes. Tarkovsky's Stalker has so many eerie similarities to the real life exclusion zone, like Bunker 4, the wish granter being sealed in a concrete building with sand, mutations, that some often misremember it as being based on Chernobyl, even though this is impossible because Stalker released in 1979 and Tarkovsky died a few months after Chernobyl of lung cancer, as did his wife and another actor from Stalker. So even the explanation of the coincidence makes it feel more like a creepy prophecy. But what you need to know is Stalker's sound editor believed all three of them had been poisoned by chemical emissions from a factory they were filming the movie around. Have I watched Stalker? I think I've seen bits of it, but I've been meaning to sit down and watch it, but it's one of those things where I know I'm going to nerd out too hard, and I'm almost nervous to watch it. I want to read Roadside Picnic first. I want to get the best translation. So what we actually find is people had reasons to be concerned about the impact of nuclear and other new technology on both the environment and their health. It was one of the most rational anxieties of the era, and they were exploring it in their fiction before Chernobyl. Chernobyl wasn't a divine, fated event. It was the realization of people's worst fears and a risk they were all very aware of. Far from the naive, uninformed way people like to portray the citizens of Pripyat and the world, there was a lot of opportunities to stop this, both within the power plant, within the Soviet Union, within various people. There were many, even within the test, there were at least 5 points where they could have stopped, and it wouldn't because of there were at least 5 points where they could have stopped because of the worrying signs, and this wouldn't have happened. If one of them had remembered, hey, we don't have the 15 controller rods in the reactor, it wouldn't have happened. Don't try, it's too boring to watch. Yeah. I do think an old Tarkovsky movie, very experimental, will be trying on the attention span, but I will watch it eventually because it's one of those things I feel like I kind of have to see to understand what's come from it, especially the games. Okay. So arts predicted Chernobyl in the same way 3 Days of the Condor predicted the US invasion of Iraq. The causes of a historical event are longer and more complicated than they seem to us now, and people can often intuit where things are headed. But from our perspective, as I said, these responses have become part of the mythology we create to make sense of a seemingly meaningless disaster. We need meaning, hence the evolution of Stalker taking elements of the movie and book and crafting a legend for the zone. And on the other side of this, an obsession with official timelines and accuracy has emerged, trying to neatly organize the disaster so we can understand it and therefore not fear it. For example, even the number plates are copied from real footage in HBO Chernobyl, which is an insane level of detail to be accurate about. But that's the attitude a lot of people take towards the zone the zone and the disaster is that accuracy is God. But myths still persist. There's the myth that there's the Bridge of Death, where people in Pripyat stood to watch the fire the night of the disaster, and they all died. That's not true. That that didn't happen. Those people didn't die. Or that the divers who went under the plant to drain the basement, to drain the water, they died. No, they didn't. Currently only one of them is dead, and he died in 2005. Yes, probably of long-term radiation exposure, but they didn't die underneath the power plant. That didn't happen. In fact, when one of the surviving divers was interviewed about it, he said it was very matter of fact. They were told, "Go do this," and they went and did it. There wasn't even a heroic speech about you have to do this for the common good of man. They did their job because nobody else could. It's very much like there are two Chernobyls. Well, there are three because I said at the start there's the place and the event. There's the event, there's the place, and there's the fictive mythology. And myth and reality of the zone collide when it comes to the objects and places left behind, which are commonly anthropomorphized. Bleh. God knows what I'm saying. Anthropomorphized. People give them emotion. People care about these objects and places. I care about these objects and places. I'm going to get crazy when we get to Duga. So here are my top 10. The swimming pool. I find this creepy because of the size. I don't know how to explain it. It's so big and empty, and it should be full of water and it isn't. Okay, it's just wrong. It's just wrong. The swimming pool is used by liquidators to clean off because of the showers. It's technically illegal to visit, but it's actually over visited. Again, a Darman Richter story here. He took one tour group in there against the rules, and then they heard some cars pull up outside, so they hid. But it turned out to be a second tour group, and then they were laughing. They started exploring it together, and then they heard some cars outside, and both tour groups had to hide now. And then a third tour group walked in, and then one of the tour guides kept watch, and the other two watched the groups. So the swimming pool is very overvisited these days, which is why it's so low here. Also about HBO TV series, a lot of Slavic neo-communists got really pissed off because show told that the Soviet regime was a reasonable disaster, and mostly it really was because of it. Yeah. Yeah, it's I saw a lot of people are very upset about how the show portrayed it. And the thing is it's like startlingly accurate. I think it's okay to admit that the regime that failed may have made some mistakes. Especially with this because, the Lithuania, they knew about this because of Lithuania. And the 2021 documents revealing the building was unstable the whole time. It's not a good look. I have a lot of love for, what the hope they had for Pripyat and what they wanted to do there, but the realization of that, it did not happen. Okay, Pripyat docks. Boats are creepy to me. Boats are creepy. And giant cranes, creepy. Metal and water. I don't think I have submechanophobia, but I have something like it. It's not fun. The riverboat / floating deck was a major transport for Pripyat locals, which you can see that on the left there. Earlier in the presentation, when I was talking about Pripyat, I showed you a group of people gathered at the docks in front of the Pripyat Cafe about to board a riverboat for transport. This is that same boat. This is what it looks like now. It's slowly sinking. Not a lot of people talk about the docks. I find it one of the creepiest parts because of the mix of the boat decay and the radiation around the water. Do you want to? Thank you, PowerPoint. Thank you. Okay. The irradiated hospital basement, which is full of firefighters' clothes. It still measures much higher than normal background radiation. It's yeah, not exactly what I'd call safe. I think it's more irradiated than the Claw of Death, but it has a much less scary name. If you know, even if it wasn't so terribly irradiated, if you know what happened to the firefighters, it's a very awful thing to think about that all these clothes were worn by these people who died so horribly, just trying to protect the rest of us. Alina's hair. After the disaster, sorry, this is the lid again. This is my obsession with the fucking lid and how much it scares me. after the disaster, the lid was named Component E, and that eventually, as I said, people like to give human characteristics to these objects in the zone because I don't exactly know why, but it's something that I do too. I do it because of my autism makes me humanize everything, but it's very common to do this to objects in the zone. So component E, the lid, is now affectionately known as Alina, and the fuel rods are known as Alina's hair. It's like got a 15-meter radius. This thing is big. The Ferris wheel. Some people are going to kill me for putting the Ferris wheel this far down the list. I think this is only like number 5, 6. Because this is the iconography of Pripyat and the Chernobyl disaster. This is one of the things that everyone knows, the bright yellow Ferris wheel. There's another myth fact divide here. The myth generally goes, oh, it never opened. A funfair, never used. But it did open. It opened early, specifically to distract the people from the disaster. So it ran for a day and then didn't run anymore. People have tried to get it moving. There's been at least one group of stalkers tried to remove the stabilizing blocks and move it. That just made it sway in the wind for a few days and reminded us all that one day this thing is going to crash down. And eventually we'll probably have to decide if we let it crash down and potentially pick up radioactive dust, or if we take it down. This is again very overvisited. Someone once said that it feels like the amusement park opened after all because the Ferris wheel gets so busy. It gets so many visitors because it's such a famous site. This is, hang on, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Yeah, I put the Ferris wheel as number 6. They're gonna kill me on Chernobyl Reddit. They're gonna rip me limb from limb. Okay, number 5. Cafe Pripyat. I love Cafe Pripyat. I love her. This is the waterfront cafe I was talking about earlier, where you catch a boat. Some of this, as you can see, some of the stained glass has survived. For Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl, this 3D glass was this glass was 3D scanned to recreate the holes in the pattern exactly. I believe there's a specific group now that takes responsibility for maintaining the holes and the pattern exactly as it is now. I love you, Cafe Pripyat. Very dear to me. Now, it's time for a superstar. You know her, baby. Everyone knows her, baby. It's Chernobyl's hottest celebrity. Literally. This is the reactor contents and fire smothering materials that all melted together into the basement to form the elephant's foot. Originally, it could only be damaged by shooting it with an AK, which chipped a bit of it off. And you can see how, like, this damage on the photo is just from the radiation that the elephant's foot is giving off. It's very, very irradiated. But it has been changing. Now, the composition is said to be closer to wet sand than dry concrete. As the materials in the elephant's foot decay and the half-life gets eaten into, it is becoming softer. So there is a real chance it doesn't even look like this anymore. It's likely started to flatten out. Elephant's foot, not quite the scary beast she used to be. Definitely, in my opinion, she's not as scary as the lid. She wishes she was, but she isn't. Number 3. Chair in the reactor. Total mystery. Maybe swept in there during the cleanup operation from the roof. Other than that, how it got on the roof? Why it's in the reactor? Nobody really knows. There's just a random wooden chair in the Chernobyl reactor 4. I love this wooden chair. I'm fascinated by it. Reactor chair is it's one of those things where once you know about it, you can't stop thinking about it because it's like, what is it doing in there? And now, like I said, we're going to go back to the claw of death. Someone just wanted to sit there and relax, nothing special. You know what, Badger? Yeah. If I ever go into the reactor, I'm taking a chair of me and I'm sitting down and I'm soaking up that radiation. I'm gonna get irradiated in leisure. Claw of death, my beloved. Okay. This was used to clean up the roof after the accident. So the radioactive materials would have been inside the bucket you see there and picked up and moved. The claw produces a reading almost 7 times higher than normal background radiation. This thing is incredibly irradiated for one object because of the work it was doing. The name is an exaggeration. You'd have to sit inside the bucket for 30 hours to receive a lethal dose, but it's still not good for your health to touch or go near an object that gives off so much radiation. It alone is changing the background radiation readings. If you put a dosimeter inside the claw, it will scream at you. It does not like to be inside the claw. This is like the claw is doing the put baby in pelican mouth bit. It's going, yes, a dosimeter mouth, a good a claw mouth, a good place to put a dosimeter. Put dosimeter in claw mouth, and the dosimeter is going, no, no. And now number 1, my wife, the Dugar. My giant metal wife. People love to say that Dugar was sinister, or had a secret brainwashing purpose, or was in some way the reason that Chernobyl blew up. But let me ask you this. If you were doing something evil and secretive, like brainwashing experiments, would you do that in one of your 10 other closed hidden cities with bunkers and quick KGB access due to being, in Russia? Or would you build a giant metal monolith next to an open city intended to present a positive image as it served your westernmost power plant, and then do your experiments under the giant metal monolith that can be seen from a great distance? Duga is an over-the-horizon radar intended to detect intercontinental ballistic missile launchers faster. Now, doesn't that sound like something perfectly reasonable to build in an era where you are most likely to need to worry about nukes being launched at you? Duga became known as the Russian woodpecker after the common sound of her signal interfering with radio broadcasts because, God, she was bad at her job. I love my stupid metal wife. She was served by a closed town, which was built around her. You can kind of see the buildings on the very, very left there. And she's been used as a creepy element in media ever since, and I oppose it. Justice for Dugas. She did nothing wrong except suck horribly at her job. And annoy people trying to listen to BBC Radio, which they deserve for listening to BBC Radio. So, conclusions. The Chornobyl Exclusion Zone's iconography fascinates and excites a wide variety of people. Some are drawn by the disaster and the eerie, tragic atmosphere. Some are drawn by the myths and legends of the zone. Some are fans of games or films like Stalker. Some are historians or scientists. Some, like me, have Chernobyl autism and are obsessed with the repetition, the unchanging town, the focus on minor details, and the empathy with inanimate objects. It's just it's like candy for my brain configuration. Some find freedom in it, like the stalkers. And yeah, a wild, apparently lawless zone to adventure in has been human fantasy almost our entire existence. We've always been, saying, oh, there's something out there to explore. There's got to be a wild land where I can run and be free and fire arrows through the glen, as Merida's dad says. Well, we made it real, and the human cost is still being counted. Um, for some further information on the zone, I recommend Darman Richter's Chernobyl, A Stalker's Guide. It's an amazing book. It's really shaped my view on the zone as a place of life rather than a place solely of death. The documentaries, there's Dogs of Chernobyl or Babushkas of Chernobyl, or Stalking Chernobyl by Cultures of Resistance. Svetlana Alexievich has written some amazing books, especially the one I'm going to be reading from for wind down time tonight is Chernobyl Prayer. It's a series of interviews with survivors telling their stories. And War Game, The Making of Stalker 2, talks about literally partially. I mean, part of it is it's only part of the documentary, but they do talk about working in the zone, gathering materials for the game, whilst the zone was under active threat from Russia, which it's very interesting to listen to. And I think that wraps us up. Yeah, okay, everyone, you did it. You made it to the end of the Chernobyl infodump. Woohoo! How long did I talk? Yeah, that was about 2 hours. That was about what I thought it was going to take. This wasn't too in depth. But it was very. This was just info dump hour basically.